Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain, and over the years, there has been plenty of talk surrounding one of the most fascinating seasons of Rangers ever produced, and that's already a point in its favor, because the best seasons of Rangers allow us to engage in unique conversations that less nuanced seasons simply don't provide. And today, we'll finally begin what I imagine will be a very long march towards discussing all of it, as we shift into get in gear and ride along with RPM. The final years of the Disney era proved to be a trying time for our beloved Ranger franchise. When we discussed Jungle Fury, I mentioned how the writer's strike created production setbacks that the production team managed to overcome. And overcome might be an understatement, since they created one of the best seasons ever despite all of that. But even having survived that ordeal, Disney was still considering closing the book on Power Rangers before RPM was greenlit. For those of you wishing that Disney would just buy back the Power Rangers, just keep that bit of information in mind. But there's no franchise that deals with hardships and unexpected setbacks the way ours does. Disney openly admitted that they lost all interest in all things Rangers before this series came to be, but from that came one of the most innovative Ranger minds of all time in Eddie Gazillion. And the first thing he did is set the Rangers in a post-apocalyptic wasteland where the main bad already killed billions of people, all but winning the war against humanity, save one domed city in the middle of who knows where. All of that in just the opening narration. We'll discuss Eddie and his contributions more in depth later, but now, let's take a look at the road to Corinth and analyze the pilot episode further. In this alternate reality Earth, a computer virus known as Vengeance kicked humanity's ass, and now we're in a fight for survival. One of the best aspects of this season is characterization, and in the opening minutes, there's already a lot done on that front. The scene you're now seeing is a scene they utilize a fair bit, because it connects back to the main three, and eventually, from that introduction, comes a more detailed backstory that gives context and weight to the baggage each of the characters come in with. What I love the most about this scene, and how it's used in conjunction with the Ranger Focus episodes, is how all of it connects to the biggest theme of RPM, which we'll of course get to. And smartly, there's no episode titled Ranger Black, because the whole point of the first 25 episodes is that Dylan can't recall his past with any real clarity. Speaking of Dylan, we soon are introduced to both him and Ziggy. It was at this point where you just knew that Ziggy was going to be a cut above the other more comedic Ranger characters, and that Dylan was going to be far more complex than your standard standoffish loner. This crazy pair eventually make it to Corinth, where they meet the Power Rangers a year after the season's first scene, except Dylan has no idea what a Power Ranger is. But we know his memories are a little unstable to say the least, since he doesn't even know his own name, so it makes sense. Fade to Black might as well be called The Road to Corinth Part 2 because of how seamlessly the two episodes flow together. With Dylan now in the know regarding Rangers, the main three bust out their overly cartoonish Zords. After Dylan assists Summer, Ziggy and him are taken in, and already we've got our first interesting development. Dylan has Vengeance hardware inside of him. I once called Summer Lansdowne the greatest Yellow Ranger ever, and it's because of moments like this. While Scott does not start off as a personable leader at all, and Flynn is just kind of along for the ride initially, Summer is the one taking initiative and trying to figure out who Dylan really is and what he's really after, which then leads us to the reveal in Waiting with Tenaya 7. But, in addition to building the foundation for Dylan's past and Summer's connection to him, Fade to Black also gives us some insight into Ziggy's history, forcing us to ask how a well-meaning goofball like him could have possibly developed such a defined reputation in the city's underbelly. But for now, Dylan has somewhat agreed to join the team. This brings us to episode 3, where we are treated to the first of several self-referential clips, because if there's one thing that Doc K makes explicitly clear, it's that her suits are not, I repeat, not spandex. But Dylan, and later Ziggy, asking what's with the spandex is a pretty legitimate question, especially since no Ranger team before them really ever questioned how skin-tight material was able to afford them enhanced power levels. Well, there is a reason behind that. You see, the origin of superheroes in tights, spandex, and other such skin-tight apparel was inspired by circus performers, the original Daredevils before, well, Daredevil, and similarly dressed heroes to him. The tights allowed for a wider range of motion versus normal clothes, which said performers absolutely needed. This eventually permeated into the henshin genre, setting the stage for Super Sentai in the mid-70s, and the rest is history. So, next time someone asks you about the spandex, you'll know the answer. Getting back to RPM, Dylan is pretty much the ideal character for which to set up the hurdle of recruitment. He's not ignorant of the Venjix threat, nor is he morally reprehensible, but he is presented as having legitimate questions and concerns throughout the series with regards to Dr. K, the Power Rangers, and the idea of being one himself. A character that is in many ways symbolic of the franchise being able to take a hard look at itself and create something of a meta-narrative from it. And every part of it worked, because Dylan was always a real character first and a challenger of standards second, which basically makes him the good version of what Mystic Force could have done with Nick. So eventually, Dylan has a more solid agreement, but only if Ziggy goes free. That happens, and later on, Ziggy tells Dylan of a way to escape the city, even though he wants him to stay. After hijacking Scott's car and considering leaving the team behind, he eventually comes to his senses and decides to help. Now that Dylan is part of the team, but for real this time, only one operator suit remains, or so we thought. And thankfully for the team, Ziggy has graciously volunteered to host a talent contest to find a suitable Green Ranger. Although, I always found it a little odd that they couldn't find an Operator Green before this, with the suit just collecting dust before now. The black suit makes more sense, because it's somewhat implied that the Black Ranger biohardware functions kind of like the Titanium Morpher, in that it has a bigger kickback for the user, so not just anyone can use it. But the green powers clearly have no such limitations, so it's a wonder that they haven't tried to recruit anyone before now. Or maybe they did, and there's a story to it that nobody's telling. A lot can happen in a year, and I do think that they maybe missed a chance here to do something creative with the Green Ranger powers before Ziggy inherits them. In any case, Go for the Green gives us the true-to-form underdog story of how Ziggy became a Ranger, and it's pretty perfect. So we finally meet Fresno Bob, a cartel boss that Ziggy used to work under, thus explaining his reputation behind bars. But Tanaya saves Ziggy from him before auditioning for the part of Green Ranger herself and passing with flying colors. Unfortunately, the reason she passes those tests is because she's a Venjix attack bot, forcing Ziggy to hightail it out of there. Then, he takes a page from the Leo Corbett playbook and pulls the old bait and switch, and before too long, the only way Ziggy can protect the Morpher is to bond to it himself and become Operator Series Green. He's not too thrilled about that development at first, but it ends up working out. The others are even less enthusiastic about the development, but because of how the bonding sequence works, there's nothing they can do about it. This franchise was fresh off giving us a great variation on that type of story, with Casey rising from Cub to Tiger Master. But even with less overall story focus on Ziggy, relatively speaking, he's still progressed in ways that are almost as great because of RPM's attention to detail. One of the best details is Ziggy's very apparent lack of fighting capabilities. That's something they screwed up a bit when it came to Justin. He's no fighter to start, but Turbo would have you believe he'd been doing this for a while now. Not to mention, it takes no time at all for him to adjust to his body literally doubling in size. But here, you can tell that it really is Ziggy under the mask, doing his best, but screwing up along the way because despite having worked in a cartel, he's the furthest thing from physically imposing. And to an extent, it made his journey just as interesting, if not more so, compared to Casey's. Casey was essentially the Naruto of Power Rangers, lots of inbuilt potential that needed to rise to the surface through the tutelage of an off-kilter but wise as all hell master, just like both of Naruto's teachers. But, following that logic, Ziggy is easily the Rock Lee, green attire and all, a guy who lacks the natural gifts of his cohorts but succeeds in his own right through diligent work and a positive attitude. But more on Ziggy when we break down the characters as a whole. With the team almost fully assembled, the focus can now shift more to Doc K in episode 5, mainly why she's a talking computer screen, and why she doesn't refer to any of the Rangers by name. A nice setup that would eventually lead into her own focus episode. And again, it's Dylan doing the reasonable thing by challenging Dr. K in a way that nobody else seems willing to do. And in doing so, we get the reveal of Doc K's true form at the end of that episode, marking an important step for her in attempting to connect with her team. It was also important as a lead into the series of flashback focus episodes that occur immediately after, since focusing more on people works better with everyone physically present. Everything up until the very end of Handshake was all about getting an initial sense of the team while recruiting 2 more members, and once that's done, it only makes sense to unveil Doc K's true form. And all of it is presented as a natural, methodical, serialized approach to storytelling that had never really been used to this extent in previous seasons. What we get is essentially a 5-part opening episode that does so much right and accomplishes so many unique things that I'll almost certainly miss a few details while trying to break it all down. We'll start with the Ziggy-Dylan dynamic. It's easy to question why Dylan, who seems constantly annoyed by Ziggy, is so insistent on defending him and sticking up for him, regardless of who's trying to bring him down. A big part of that is how Dylan functions as a brilliant challenger of both this show and the franchise as a whole. He consistently questions things that most Rangers would just take for granted as givens. So fittingly, both him and Ziggy represent innovative variations on the non-traditional Ranger archetype. Whether it's a bully in jail, Scott, or Dr. K, Dylan takes issue with either of them being contained by the standards that were set in place years ago. If anything, Dylan is probably happier that it's Ziggy as the Green Ranger, because if he succeeds, which he does, then everyone else was wrong about him, which only further solidifies his perspective. But I also think that a big part of it is something that Dylan mentions to Summer about letting someone down. Summer's response to this is perfect, recognizing Dylan as the kind of person that's clearly affected by such a failure, and as a result, would do that much more to defend the people in harm's way now. Even as a barely recognizable memory, Dylan understands the pain of loss, but it's not holding him back, it's motivating him. What this all adds up to is Dylan now viewing Ziggy as the person he can't let down, because if something happens to him that he could have stopped, then his history repeats itself. That initial connection, despite Ziggy's at times overactive mouth, is the foundation of their brotherhood, and it's why Dylan always defends him, even after Ziggy kind of sold him out in episode 2. And the best part about all of this is how subtle it is. The show in no way outright tells you that this is the case, and maybe it's not, but it all seems to add up, given what they do choose to show us and what we can then infer from it. There's no emotional flashback that directly connects his sort of brother now to his sister then, and certainly no overt dialogue on that front. It's all done through careful teleplay. And speaking of emotional flashbacks, it ends up being Summer who is most attentive of Dylan's plight. Dylan and Summer might just be one of the strongest romantic pairs in the franchise, and it's all set up through Summer being his primary recruiter. She made it very clear early on that she cares about where Dylan is going, so it makes perfect sense that she ends up being constantly worried about his well-being. Even Dr. K, who suffers from a severe lack of emotional comprehension, can clearly see what Summer sees in Dylan, a guy who, as Summer states, is worth saving. And the connection is not something the show ever forgets about, because one of many things RPM is a master of is developing and progressing subplots alongside whatever the main plot of the week happens to be. The other pretty sizable thing that the first 5 episodes set up is Vengex himself and the world he is nearly done conquering. The cold open was one thing, but it also set the bar incredibly high for Vengex himself. As a Ranger villain, only a handful of galactic adversaries like Emperor Grum could lay claim to heavy death tolls, but Vengex is doing it from one planet, our planet. And ironically enough, that actually gives it a larger sense of scale versus the destruction of entire star systems, since those systems are all fictional. With RPM, it's on us, only us, to not even stop the threat initially, but to survive it. So given all of that, Vengex had the unenviable job of justifying that immense sense of weight placed upon the story in the first 2 minutes. And initially, he more than delivers. From the start, you can see that he really is a thinking, strategic machine, one that builds multiple kinds of robots for a variety of specific purposes. It's not just whatever monster, demon, or orc happens to be around this week. There is a real plan behind almost all of it. Plans that have clearly worked before, since, again, billions dead. He is rarely just trying to destroy the Rangers. His primary goal is weakening Corinth itself, by targeting the systems that run the city more so than the people thereof, who he could easily eliminate once the city is compromised, which is exactly what he did to the rest of the world. And even then, Dr. K informs us that Vengex tech is always advancing. So, to keep up, the Rangers have to constantly advance their own team, ergo, why there was such a push to recruit Dylan in the first place. The last major thing the first 5 episodes set up is the good doctor herself. It takes her that whole time to finally reveal herself to the team, and if Dylan hadn't come around, she might still just be that talking computer screen. But the real question is, why? Why is it that avoiding personal connections means so much to her? Why would she attempt to save the world, but hide her face? Who is Dr. K, really? The best seasons are able to effectively answer questions like these, and RPM is no exception. And, for as sinister as Venjix proves to be, the eventual unraveling of Dr. K's past begins to reveal an arguably even larger evil than him. After all, how evil can a computer program really be, relative to the people responsible for creating it? We'll tackle all of that, as well as digging more into the characters in the forthcoming Part 2 and Part 3. You all knew this was going to be a trek. But until then, thanks for watching.